Welcome to Rights and Remedies, the podcast where we explore the law, the fight for justice, and healing. I'm Allison Mahoney, your host and a lawyer dedicated to fighting for the rights of survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, as well as children harmed by the child welfare system. Each week, we delve into legal battles and court cases, share powerful stories that demand change, and spotlight the cutting-edge practices that are helping victims on their journey to healing. So, if you're ready to dive into the intersection of advocacy and healing, subscribe to Rights and Remedies today. New episodes are released weekly, and we can't wait to have you join the conversation. Together, we can make a difference. Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about the intersection of domestic violence or intimate partner violence and cyber abuse. Domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behaviors in any relationship that's used by one partner, the abusive partner, to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner, the victim. This is a huge problem in the United States. It affects 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men. There's a number of different types of abuses that fall under the umbrella of domestic violence. This might include psychological abuse, which includes things like belittling a victim, criticizing them, shouting or yelling at them, name calling. It could also include physical abuse, which involves physically assaulting a victim, maybe strangling them, burning them, punching them. Sexual abuse, which includes unwanted touching, sexual assault. It might include forced sex work. And then financial abuse as well, which includes taking and controlling a victim's money, not allowing the victim to work, or maybe racking up debts in the victim's name. All of these different types of abuses are forms of domestic violence. To help illustrate how the abuse occurs, back in the 1980s, the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth, Minnesota, developed what's called the Power and Control Wheel, which we'll link to that in our show notes so you can look at it if you're not familiar with it. But again, the wheel describes how abusers assert power and control over victims and the different tactics they use. So on the inside of the wheel, we see the subtle, continual behaviors that abusers engage in over time. This includes things like isolating a victim, maybe minimizing or denying a victim's experience, economic abuse, coercion and threats, emotional abuse. And then on the outer ring of the wheel, we see physical and sexual violence. And the idea is that the outer ring, so the sexual and physical abuse, often reinforce the regular use of the other more subtle methods found in the inner portion of the wheel. Cyber abuse, which is also referred to as technology-facilitated abuse, fits within this framework and is used by abusers to gain and maintain power and control over victims. There are a number of different types of cyber abuses, and they are constantly evolving. I'm going to go over some of the main categories that we hear about. So one is called image-based sexual abuse, which is also referred to as revenge porn or non-consensual pornography. Image-based sexual abuse involves sharing or even threatening to share someone's intimate images without their consent, and when the victim had a reasonable expectation that those images would remain private. That means that if a victim and an abusive partner are together and they sext, they send each other intimate images over text message, a victim would have a reasonable expectation that those would remain private and that they wouldn't be posted on a website, for example. Deepfakes are another type of cyber abuse, and this involves using artificial intelligence to create nude, intimate photos or videos of the victim, which can then be used to perpetrate acts of image-based sexual abuse. So there's technology where you can take a person's face and superimpose it on top of a naked body so it looks like it's that person who's nude, and then the abuser can post those images online. So very, very dangerous and scary. Doxing involves, it's a malicious act. It's the malicious act of publicly revealing a victim's private or personally identifiable information online without the victim's consent. We often see this accompanying image-based sexual abuse. So, for example, an abuser might post a nude image of a victim on social media or on a revenge porn site. Revenge porn sites are these horrible websites that are created essentially to victimize and harm people. So they might post a victim's picture or video, and then underneath it include the victim's home address, phone number, email. And this is incredibly dangerous because then internet trolls can get a hold of that information and to start to harass the victim, which may remain online, but it can also transform into a real danger of physical violence. People can show up at a victim's home if they have their address. Another cyber abuse is sextortion. Sextortion occurs when someone threatens to distribute a victim's private and sensitive material if they don't provide them images of a sexual nature, sexual favors, or money. So, for example, an abuser might say, if you don't do this, then I'm going to release your images online. That's just an example. Cyber stalking and cyber tracking is also a huge problem in the domestic violence space. Cyber stalking happens when an electronic medium like a phone, an email, a social media site, or a message board is used to harass, harm, or create fear in the victim. And it can include things like an abuser sending inappropriate messages and manipulating a victim to interact with them. Abusers want to keep the victim engaged. They do not like when victims cut them off. It's usually done to assert control or maybe to seek revenge or punish a victim for not complying with an abuser's demands. Cyber stalking can also include using GPS tracking devices, surveillance apps, and spyware. There's also keylogging software that allows an abuser to record a victim's keystrokes without the victim's knowledge. And then those recorded keystrokes are used to gain access to sensitive information like passwords. And once an abuser has a victim's passwords, they can log in and see their emails, they can see what's being said, maybe they can log into social media accounts, they can post fake things, they can impersonate them. And like I mentioned, they can also gain access to a lot of private information. Abusers also sometimes install spy cams in victims' homes. And this can be it's used to record victims without their knowledge. Sometimes it's placed in areas just so they can monitor, which is still problematic. Other times there's a more nefarious reason for installing spy cams. So abusers may install spy cams in a bathroom or in a bedroom, in places where a victim would possibly be nude or in intimate situations. And then they can take that material, that coverage that they get, and weaponize it and use it against the victim, for instance, by threatening to post it online or by posting it online. Ultimately, abusers use technology to surveil victims, to isolate them, and they isolate them by controlling their communication with third parties or by embarrassing and humiliating them to the point where victims don't want to go out into public. And then abusers also use tech to impersonate victims, and they impersonate them usually in an attempt to damage their reputation. So to provide a few examples of this, an abuser might use image-based sexual abuse to publicly humiliate a victim to punish them for leaving them. They can publicly humiliate them either by posting intimate images on the website, on social media, or by sending the images to a victim's friends, family members, anyone in what would be their support network. Abusers can also make a victim feel like they deserve the image-based sexual abuse if the victim created or co-created the intimate images. This may happen if a victim and the abuser, while they're in a relationship or dating, were sexting and sharing intimate images with one another with the expectation, of course, that they would remain private and not go outside of those two parties. And so an abuser may turn around and say, well, you sent me a naked photo, and so you have no right to complain if I then post it on a revenge porn website. Abusers also may use image-based sexual abuse to try and harm a victim's career. For example, by sending images, which could include photos or videos, to a victim's boss or work colleagues. And if the images are already out there and online, a victim might be so humiliated that they leave their job. They may have a hard time getting a new job because anytime anyone Googles their name, they find these images on the internet. Abusers also might send images to a victim's extended family, to their children, to parents at the children's school, or teachers at the school, all in an attempt to humiliate and shame them and maintain power and control. As I mentioned, abusers also might post images on revenge porn websites, which expose the victim to harassment and potentially physical harm by trolls. I've seen situations where abusers have posted images of a victim and then impersonated the victim and pretended that the victim was into rape fantasies, and then supplied the victim's address, true physical address, online. And so now there is a real risk of strangers going to the victim's home to try and play out this alleged rape fantasy that the victim does not have in reality. So very, very dangerous. And abusers also use the threat of sharing images to keep a victim in the relationship. They might hang it over their head for years that if the victim doesn't comply, if the victim leaves the relationship, then these images will be shared and the victim will be left to deal with the mess. Now, other forms of domestic violence often accompany the use of cyber abuses. One prime example is gaslighting. Gaslighting is a term that came from a film in 1944 called Gaslight. And in that film, the abuser dims the gas lights, and the victim keeps commenting that, oh, the lights are dimmer, they're not as bright. And the abuser says, no, what are you talking about? You're crazy. They have been the same this entire time. And as a result, the victim in the movie starts to question her own reality. That's gaslighting. So today, what we see with gaslighting, the effects of gaslighting today are that a victim second guesses herself. She might feel anxious or overly sensitive and confused. She might have a hard time making decisions because she doesn't trust her own judgment. She also might feel hopeless, depressed, not trust her own decisions. And as a result of all of these things, victims start relying on the abuser to define their reality, which can be very, very dangerous. So the effects of victims of domestic violence, the effect of cyber abuses on victims of domestic violence are severe and really worth paying attention to. They can cause victims to be isolated. They maybe cannot and then choose to not connect with their supports in their community. That might be because they're being tracked and they know that the abuser is watching, or it might be because they're so humiliated by what the abuser has done or is threatening to do, or scared of what the abuser is threatening to do, that they isolate. Their mental health can also take a major, major toll. They might suffer from paranoia, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideations. Many victims have a shattered sense of self-esteem. They experience a lot of shame as well. And one of the problems with image-based sexual abuse is that when the content is online, the victim has to suffer from exposure to that abuse over and over and over again. It's a persistent form of abuse because it lives online. And research is showing that image-based sexual abuse appears to have the same post-assault symptoms as in-person or face-to-face sexual violence. But with image-based sexual abuse, the abuse has a longer duration because the content is online and it can be shared and reshared and reshared. Victims also experience financial loss as the result of image-based sexual abuse. They might spend money and significant portions of their time trying to take images down from the internet. They might have to hire lawyers. They might engage in mental health services. They may have to move. They might lose their job or change jobs because they can't deal with the stress and the shame if people within their company know what's happened. The good news is there are places for victims to turn for help. It's not a hopeless situation. They can turn to law enforcement and report the crime. They can also go to local nonprofits like domestic violence organizations, which are becoming increasingly savvy and well-equipped to deal with these types of abuses. Or they can look for national resources like the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative for help and for information to at least point them in the right direction of what steps to take. They can also hire a lawyer, and especially a lawyer who specializes in this area of law, which is very nuanced and changing quite rapidly. They can seek help from mental health professionals, and then, of course, they can connect with their support network so that they don't feel so alone and isolated and reliant on the abuser. Thank you so much for listening. We'll dive more into this topic in other episodes as well. But thanks and have a good night. Thank you for joining us on Rights and Remedies. I hope today's episode gave you valuable insights into the legal issues facing victims and the pathways to healing. Remember, you're not alone in this journey. Whether you're a survivor, an advocate, or someone looking to learn more, we're here to support and empower you. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. You can also follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn at ALM Law LLC for updates, resources, and more. Until next time, take care and remember that together we can make a difference.